The wind howled like a beast through the empty streets of New York City, rattling street signs and sending icy chills deep into Elena's bones. She clutched her daughter Sophie closer to her chest, trying in vain to shield her from the merciless cold. Snow swirled violently around them, blanketing the sidewalks in an unforgiving layer of frost. Her boots, worn and thin, did little to keep the freezing wetness from seeping through. The city, usually alive with the sound of honking taxis and hurried footsteps, now felt like a deserted graveyard. "Mommy, I'm cold." Sophie's tiny voice trembled against the wind, her lips a shade too close to blue. Elena forced a smile, though her heart clenched with guilt. "I know, sweetheart. Just hold on a little longer, okay?" But how much longer? They had been walking for hours, turned away from every shelter they had tried. Some were overcrowded, others simply didn't care. People peered from behind their curtains, but no one offered help. Rejection after rejection had left Elena on the edge of hopelessness. Then, through the thick curtain of falling snow, she saw it. A towering brownstone mansion, its massive windows glowing warm and golden against the icy darkness. The light spilling onto the frost-covered driveway looked almost inviting. Almost like hope. Elena's heartbeat quickened. Maybe this was their last chance. Maybe someone inside had a heart big enough to let a mother and child inside for the night. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Who lived here? Would they even care? She hesitated at the iron gates, gripping the cold metal as she stared up at the grand estate. Her pride screamed at her not to do this, but desperation left her with no choice. She pushed the gate open and stepped onto the pristine driveway, each step heavier than the last. "We'll try here," Elena murmured, more to herself than Sophie, though her voice was laced with uncertainty. Sophie didn't reply, too exhausted to question her mother's decisions anymore. When they reached the grand double doors, Elena faltered. What if they turned her away too? What if this was just another cruel reminder that the world didn't care? She clenched her fists. No more hesitation, no more fear. With one deep breath, she knocked firmly, the sound echoing into the stillness of the stormy night. Seconds stretched into eternity. Nothing. Elena's shoulders slumped. Maybe they were wasting their time. Just as she turned to leave, the heavy door creaked open. Elena froze, breath catching in her throat. Standing in the doorway, his sharp green eyes widening in shock, was a man she never thought she'd see again. "Elena?" Nicholas Bennett whispered, his voice laced with disbelief. For a moment, the storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside Elena's chest. Of all the houses in New York, she had ended up here, at his doorstep. Fate had led her back to the one man she had spent years trying to forget. And now, there was no turning back. For a moment, Elena was frozen in place. The icy wind cut through the night, howling past the towering New York brownstone, but all she could hear was the wild pounding of her own heart. The man standing before her was someone she had tried to bury in the past, someone she had convinced herself she would never see again. Nicholas Bennett. His sharp green eyes were locked onto hers, flickering between confusion and shock. His chiseled features had barely changed, though there was a new hardness to them, a quiet intensity that hadn't been there before. He looked older, sharper, no longer the boy she had once known, but a man with power and authority written in every inch of him. And he was staring at her like she was a ghost. "Elena?" he breathed, barely above a whisper. Her throat went dry. She hadn't spoken his name in years, and now, standing on his doorstep, drenched in snow with her daughter Sophie trembling in her arms, she couldn't find her voice. "Mommy, I'm so tired," Sophie whimpered, breaking the unbearable silence. Elena's grip on her tightened. She couldn't afford to break down. Not now. She tore her gaze away from Nicholas and focused on the only thing that mattered, keeping her daughter safe. Nicholas followed her gaze, his expression shifting as he took in the sight before him. His confusion deepened. He stared at Sophie, her tiny frame wrapped in a threadbare coat, her blonde curls damp from the snow, her wide blue eyes peering up at him with an innocence that made something tighten in his chest. Then, a flicker of realization crossed his face. "Come inside," he said suddenly, stepping aside. Elena hesitated. Could she really do this? Could she walk back into his world after all these years? But then she felt Sophie's body shiver violently in her arms, and she knew she had no choice. Without a word, she stepped inside. The warmth of the house wrapped around her instantly, in stark contrast to the frozen world outside. The grand entrance was just as she remembered, gleaming marble floors, high ceilings, and walls adorned with expensive artwork. But there was something different now, something colder. The warmth wasn't in the home itself, but rather in the way Nicholas watched her, his eyes unreadable, yet burning with unspoken questions. She braced herself. She knew what was coming. "What are you doing here?" he asked finally, his voice low, measured. She swallowed. How could she possibly explain? Elena had spent years running, from him, from the past, from the truth. But now, standing in his home, face to face with the man she had once loved, she realized there was nowhere left to run. Her past had finally caught up to her, and Nicholas Bennett wasn't going to let her disappear again. Nicholas could feel the storm raging outside, but it was nothing compared to the one building inside him. He leaned against the marble kitchen counter, his hands gripping the edge as if to steady himself. Elena was here. After all these years, she was standing in his house, her clothes damp from the snow, her eyes full of secrets, and a little girl at her side who looked so much like, no. His mind refused to go there. Across the room, Elena sat stiffly on the leather couch, clutching her daughter, Sophie, to her chest. The girl had fallen asleep, her tiny body exhausted from the cold and hunger. The flickering fireplace cast a soft glow across the room, making the moment feel almost surreal. Nicholas wasn't sure if he was still processing the fact that Elena had walked back into his life, or if he was still trying to understand why she had left in the first place. "You're not saying anything," Elena murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Nicholas exhaled sharply, running a hand through his dark hair before finally meeting her gaze. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "You show up in the middle of the night, during a storm, with a child." His voice faltered. His eyes flickered toward Sophie, still fast asleep, her small chest rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. His gut twisted. "You left without a word, Elena, and now you're here. Explain." She flinched at the quiet intensity in his tone. "I never meant to show up here. I didn't even know this was your house." "That doesn't answer my question." Elena looked down at Sophie, brushing a stray curl from her forehead. "I had nowhere else to go." There was something in her voice, something fragile and raw, that made Nicholas hesitate. He had spent years convincing himself that he was over her, that he had buried whatever feelings he once had deep enough that they could never resurface. But now she was here. And despite everything, despite the pain and anger swirling inside him, he couldn't turn her away. "Elena," he said carefully, "is she—" Her breath hitched. For a brief second, her mask slipped, and in her eyes, he saw panic, hesitation, and something else, guilt. His chest tightened. He knew. Even before she nodded, before the soft, whispered yes left her lips, he knew. Nicholas took a step back, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the crackling fire. 5 years. 5 years, and he had no idea he had a daughter. He swallowed hard, his hands balling into fists at his sides. You kept her from me. Tears welled in Elena's eyes. I thought it was for the best. For who? His voice was sharp, edged with pain. Because it sure as hell wasn't for me. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Nicholas forced himself to take a breath. He couldn't change the past, but he could damn well fight for the future. And he wasn't going to let Elena disappear again. The clock on the fireplace mantel ticked in deafening silence. Nicholas paced across the polished wooden floor, his hands shoved deep into his pockets, his mind racing. A daughter. He had a daughter. And for 5 years, he had been nothing more than a ghost to her. Elena sat still on the couch, her fingers gripping the blanket wrapped around Sophie. The firelight danced across her face, highlighting the exhaustion in her features, the worry in her eyes. But Nicholas wasn't ready to feel sorry for her. Not yet. You thought keeping this from me was for the best? His voice was tight, controlled, but barely. He stopped pacing and turned to face her. Did you even think about what this would do to me? Elena swallowed hard, her hands shaking as she stroked Sophie's hair. I thought I was protecting you, she whispered. Nicholas let out a bitter laugh. Protecting me? From what, exactly? From my own child? She flinched. He could see the battle waging in her eyes, the guilt, the regret, but it did nothing to cool the fury burning inside him. You don't understand, she said quietly. I was alone, Nicholas. I had nothing. No home, no support, no way to reach you. And even if I did... She hesitated. I convinced myself that you were better off without us. He clenched his jaw, his chest tightening. You don't get to decide that. Elena's eyes filled with tears, but she held his gaze. You were starting your career. You had everything ahead of you. I didn't want to ruin that for you. Ruin what? Nicholas ran a frustrated hand through his hair. Elena, you were everything to me. You disappearing like that? He exhaled sharply. You didn't just take yourself away, you took my daughter away, and you expect me to be okay with that? I don't expect you to be okay with it, she admitted, her voice trembling. I don't expect forgiveness, Nicholas, but I need you to understand that I thought I was doing what was right. Nicholas shook his head, his fists tightening. He had spent years thinking she left because she didn't love him, that she had simply walked away without looking back. And now, here she was, telling him that she had been struggling, that she had been fighting to survive. And yet, she still never gave him the chance to be there. Sophie stirred in Elena's arms, letting out a soft sigh as she shifted in her sleep. Nicholas's gaze softened as he watched her. His daughter. His flesh and blood. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter, steadier. I lost 5 years, Elena. 5 years of birthdays, of first words, of her first steps. You can't give that back to me. Elena nodded, her face crumbling with emotion. I know. Nicholas took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving Sophie's face. But I won't lose another second. He met Elena's gaze, his expression unreadable. I don't care what happened before. I don't care about your reasons. What I care about is Sophie, and from this moment on, I will be in her life. Elena blinked, fresh tears slipping down her cheeks. You mean that? His jaw tightened. More than anything. And in that moment, everything changed. A fragile truce. The air between Nicholas and Elena was thick with tension, a delicate balance between anger and understanding. The weight of the past still hung over them, but there was something else now, an unspoken agreement, a fragile truce. Days passed in a blur. Nicola was still adjusting to the shocking truth that he was a father, that Sophie had existed for 5 years without him. He found himself watching her constantly, memorizing every little thing. The way her tiny nose wrinkled when she was curious, how she clung to her mother's side whenever she felt uncertain, and most of all, how much of him he saw in her. She had his eyes. It was undeniable. But there were cracks in this newfound reality, moments where the past threatened to drag them under. One evening, Nicholas found Elena standing in the kitchen, staring at an old mug she had found in one of his cabinets. He recognized it instantly. Her favorite one, from years ago, still tucked away in the same spot. She turned it over in her hands, her fingers tracing the faded pattern. "You kept this," she murmured, almost to herself. Nicholas crossed his arms, leaning against the doorway. "I didn't throw everything away." She glanced at him, something flickering in her eyes. "I thought you hated me." His jaw tightened. "I did." He exhaled sharply. "Maybe a part of me still does." Elena swallowed hard, placing the mug down gently. "I never wanted this to happen, Nicholas. I never wanted to hurt you." He studied her for a long moment. "Then why didn't you come back?" She looked away, guilt shadowing her features. "Because I didn't know how." Silence stretched between them, the ghosts of their past whispering in the stillness. "I want to be in her life," Nicholas finally said, breaking the tension. Elena nodded. "I know." "No, Elena," he said, stepping closer. "I mean really be in her life. I don't want to be some stranger she barely knows. I don't want to be the man who just sends checks and visits on weekends." His voice was firm, unwavering. "I want to be her father." Elena met his gaze, searching his face for any trace of hesitation. She found none. "She's never had that before," she admitted quietly. "Then it's time she does." A long pause. Then, finally, a reluctant nod. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a clean slate. But it was a start. That night, Nicholas sat on the living room floor with Sophie, watching as she carefully stacked blocks into a lopsided tower. She peeked up at him shyly, waiting for his reaction. "Whoa," he said, grinning. "That's the tallest tower I've ever seen." Sophie giggled, knocking it over with a dramatic swipe. Nicholas laughed, a sound that felt foreign but right. Elena watched from the doorway, her heart twisting at the sight. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to hope. Nicholas wasn't sure when it happened, but something inside him shifted. At first, it was subtle. Small moments where he found himself looking forward to hearing Sophie's laughter echo through the house, or noticing the way Elena's shoulders relaxed when she realized she wasn't carrying the weight of everything alone. But as the days turned into weeks, the shift became undeniable. He was no longer just a man grappling with the past. He was a father, learning to navigate an unfamiliar, yet strangely fulfilling reality. One Saturday morning, he woke up to the sound of little feet pattering against the hardwood floor. Before he could fully register what was happening, Sophie was climbing onto his bed, her bright eyes peeking over the blanket. "Wake up, Daddy," she whispered, as if she was letting him in on a secret. His heart skipped a beat at the word. Daddy. He had heard it before, but this time it didn't feel like something distant, something uncertain. It was real. It was his. He smiled, ruffling her hair. "You're up early." Sophie nodded seriously. "I had a dream about a castle." "A castle, huh?" Nicholas sat up, stretching. "Was I in it?" Sophie giggled. "No, silly. Just me and Mommy." His smile faltered, But before the pang of sadness could take hold, she added, "But maybe you could come next time." Something in his chest tightened, not in pain, but in hope. That day, he took Sophie to the park while Elena stayed behind to get some much-needed rest. At first, he was unsure of himself, constantly glancing at the other fathers, mimicking the way they caught their kids at the bottom of the slide or pushed them gently on the swings. But then Sophie turned to him, eyes full of unfiltered joy, and everything else melted away. "Push me higher, Daddy," he grinned. "Higher? Are you sure?" Sophie nodded eagerly. Nicholas braced himself, then gave her a playful push. Her laughter rang through the air as the swing soared higher, her tiny hands gripping the chains tightly. He had never felt anything like it before, this overwhelming sense of purpose, of belonging. When they returned home, Elena was waiting for them at the door, a hesitant smile on her lips. "How was it?" she asked. Sophie beamed. "Daddy pushed me super high." Elena's gaze flickered to Nicholas, something unreadable in her eyes. "That sounds like fun," she said softly. Nicholas nodded. "Yeah, it was." They stood there for a moment, a quiet understanding passing between them. There was still so much left unsaid, so much to figure out. But as Sophie hugged his leg, refusing to let go, Nicholas realized something. For the first time in years, he wasn't lost in his past. He was building a future, and that future had a name, a smile, and the sweetest laugh he had ever heard. Nicholas sat in his study that evening, staring at the unopened envelope on his desk. It had arrived earlier that day, a plain white envelope carrying the weight of everything he didn't know about the past 5 years. His fingers hovered over it, hesitant. He had spent weeks adjusting to this new reality, being a father, coexisting with Elena under the same roof, slowly piecing together the remnants of what had been broken. But this was different. This was the truth. Taking a deep breath, he tore it open. The papers inside were a collection of medical records, financial statements, and legal documents, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't even known existed. His eyes scanned the words, taking in phrases that made his stomach churn. Emergency hospital visits, overdue rent notices, custody concerns. Elena had suffered, she had struggled, and she had done it alone. A sharp knock on the door made him look up. She stood in the doorway, her arms crossed over her chest, her face unreadable. "You got the documents," she said, her voice steady, but he could hear the exhaustion underneath. Nicholas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Why didn't you tell me?" Elena let out a humorless laugh. "Tell you?" she repeated. "You mean when I was working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over Sophie's head? Or when I sat outside hospitals, praying that the fever would break because I couldn't afford another medical bill? When, Nicholas? When was I supposed to call the man who had a perfect life, a perfect career, and tell him that I was drowning?" Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much time being angry that she left. He never once considered what she was running toward. "I would have helped," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elena shook her head. "And then what? You would have dropped a check in the mail? Sent someone else to deal with it?" She took a step forward, her gaze burning into his. "I didn't just need money, Nicholas. I needed support. I needed a partner. And you were too busy being successful to notice I was breaking." Silence hung heavy between them. For the first time, Nicholas truly saw her. Not just the woman he had loved years ago, not just the mother of his child, but a survivor, someone who had carried burdens he never even knew existed. His chest ached. "I don't know how to fix this," he admitted, his voice raw. "But I want to try." Elena studied him, searching for something, maybe sincerity, maybe regret. Then she sighed, her shoulders finally sagging under the weight of it all. "You can't fix the past, Nicholas," she murmured, "but maybe we can figure out the future." For the first time in years, the distance between them felt a little smaller. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to make things right. The days that followed were filled with an uneasy but necessary rhythm. Nicholas and Elena moved around each other carefully, like two people navigating a fragile bridge. One wrong step, and everything would collapse. They weren't enemies anymore, but they weren't partners either. Sophie, however, was oblivious to the quiet war they fought within themselves. She had blossomed in the comfort of having both parents under one roof, her laughter ringing through the house in a way that made Nicholas realize just how much he had missed. He had spent years chasing deals, but now he was chasing moments, ones that had been slipping through his fingers without him even noticing. One evening, he found himself watching Elena from the doorway of the kitchen. She was helping Sophie with an art project, her hands smudged with paint, a strand of hair falling loose from her ponytail. She laughed when Sophie smeared a streak of blue across her cheek, and for a brief moment, she looked just like the woman he had fallen in love with all those years ago. Something in his chest tightened. "You're staring," she said without looking up, her voice teasing but guarded. Nicholas cleared his throat and stepped into the room. "I was just thinking, I don't think I've ever seen you paint before." Elena paused, glancing at him before returning her focus to Sophie. "I used to," she admitted, "before everything got complicated." He nodded, remembering the way she used to sketch in the margins of her notebooks back in college. "You were good," he said. "Really good." She gave a small shrug. "Life happens." "But does it have to?" he wanted to ask. Instead, he leaned down and ruffled Sophie's hair. "What are we making?" "A family portrait," Sophie announced proudly, holding up a half-finished drawing. Nicholas's heart stopped when he saw it. There they were, 3 stick figures standing in front of a house, holding hands. Sophie had drawn herself in the middle, with him and Elena on either side. Above their heads, she had scribbled in big, uneven letters, "My family." His throat felt tight. Elena must have seen the change in his expression because she quickly turned to Sophie. "Why don't you go show Mike your drawing? He'll love it." Sophie beamed and scampered off, her masterpiece in hand. The moment she was gone, the tension in the room thickened. "She thinks this is permanent," Nicholas said after a moment, his voice quieter. Elena sighed, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "I know." Nicholas exhaled slowly. "And is it?" She hesitated. "I don't know, Nicholas," she finally said. "But for the first time in a long time, I don't want to run." His eyes met hers, searching, hoping. "Then maybe," he said carefully, "we stop thinking about what's temporary or permanent. Maybe we just try." A long silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something fragile, something real, and for now, it was enough. The mansion no longer felt like a museum of lost time. It was changing, growing into something else, something warmer. The echoes of Sophie's laughter filled the once empty halls, and even the air itself seemed lighter, no longer weighed down by memories of heartbreak and regret. Nicholas found himself drawn to the simple moments, the way Elena tucked Sophie into bed at night, the way she absent-mindedly hummed while cooking, the soft glow in her eyes when she watched Sophie play. He had spent years convincing himself he had moved on, that the past was just a lesson in pain. But now, with Elena here, the past wasn't just a wound. It was a chance to heal. One evening, as the sun dipped below the city skyline, Nicholas found Elena standing on the balcony, gazing out at the world beyond. The golden light kissed her features, making her look almost ethereal. He hesitated before stepping closer, his voice gentle. "You still thinking about leaving?" Elena didn't turn around immediately. She took a slow breath before answering. "I don't know. For the first time in years, I don't feel like I have to." That admission sent something deep inside him stirring. He leaned against the railing beside her. "Good," he said, "because I'm not ready to say goodbye again." She glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "You used to be good at letting go, Nicholas. You never looked back." He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe I was wrong." The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of rain. They stood in silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts, both knowing that what was left unsaid mattered more than the words they could ever find. Finally, Elena spoke again. "I thought about you, all these years." His breath hitched. "Then why did you stay away?" She looked down at her hands. "Because I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought you were better off without me." Nicholas shook his head, his jaw tightening. "That wasn't your choice to make." Elena swallowed hard, guilt flickering in her eyes. "I know." Silence, heavy, thick, and then a shift. Nicholas reached out, hesitating for only a second before tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered just a moment too long, just enough to make her breath hitch. "Elena," he murmured, voice low, almost pleading. She met his gaze, something unreadable flashing in her eyes. This was the moment where the past met the present, where old wounds could either be reopened or finally be allowed to heal. Before she could respond, the door creaked open behind them. "Mommy? Daddy?" Sophie's sleepy voice interrupted the charged air between them. Elena stepped back, composing herself. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sophie rubbed her eyes, yawning. "I had a bad dream. Can I sleep with you?" Nicholas crouched down and lifted her into his arms without hesitation. "Of course, sweetheart." As they walked inside together, Elena caught his eye over Sophie's shoulder. Maybe this was how healing began, not in grand gestures, but in small, quiet moments. The morning sun cast a golden glow through the windows, filling the mansion with warmth. For the first time in years, the house no longer felt like an empty monument to the past. It felt like a home. The echoes of Sophie's laughter filled the air as she chased her toy car across the marble floors, the soft tap of her feet creating a rhythm that felt right. Elena stood at the kitchen counter, watching Nicholas from the corner of her eye. He was helping Sophie reach a glass from the cabinet, his large hands steadying hers as she stretched up on her tiptoes. A year ago, she would have never imagined this moment, never allowed herself to dream of it. Now, she didn't know how to imagine a life without it. "Got it!" Sophie giggled as she clutched the glass triumphantly. Nicholas ruffled her hair with a smirk. "See? Told you we'd make a good team." Elena smiled, but the weight of the past still lingered in her chest. She had spent so long running, convincing herself that Nicholas was better off without her, that she was better off alone. But standing here, watching him with Sophie, she saw the truth she had been too scared to face. They belonged together. Taking a deep breath, she spoke. "Nicholas, can we talk?" His expression shifted instantly. He nodded, his gaze searching hers. "Of course." Sophie, completely oblivious to the tension in the room, had already darted off to the living room with her toy car. Nicola leaned against the counter, waiting. Elena hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. I used to think that leaving was the right thing to do, that keeping Sophie away from you was protecting both of you. She swallowed. I was wrong. Nicholas didn't say anything, but she could see the way his jaw tightened, the way his hands curled into loose fists. She had hurt him. She had stolen years from him. And yet he was still standing here, still listening. I don't want to run anymore, she whispered. I don't want Sophie to grow up thinking love is something that disappears when things get hard. I want her to see that people can change, that mistakes can be forgiven. Nicholas exhaled sharply, his head tilting slightly as he processed her words. What are you saying, Elena? She met his gaze, her heart pounding. I'm saying, if you're willing to try, I am too. For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. Then, Nicholas pushed off the counter and closed the space between them. He reached out, hesitating for only a second, before gently tucking a strand of hair behind her ear, just like he had done the night before. I never stopped loving you, he admitted, his voice rough, raw. I never stopped wanting this. Elena felt her throat tighten, but this time, the tears that welled in her eyes weren't from sadness. They were from relief. Sophie's laughter rang through the house again, a bright, joyful sound. Nicholas smiled. Then let's build something new. Together. And just like that, the past finally loosened its grip. The future had begun.